Humanity Rising, day 743. I'm Tom Eddington, filling in.
Tom, you're on mute.
Tom, we're not live yet, but you just need to play the intro. Give me a second.
Okay. Welcome everyone to Humanity Rising, day 743. I'm Tom Eddington, filling in for Jim Garrison while he's traveling in France. Delighted to be hosting day 2 of the Ukrainian mini summit we have this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Today's program is focused on the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, the rocky road to democracy. And just delighted to have had a rich conversation yesterday and looking forward to today's session and tomorrow. And as I mentioned yesterday, and Jim has often shared throughout the Humanity Rising broadcast, that part of the mission of Humanity Rising is the pursuit of truth, not the possession of it. And what we were able to have yesterday were voices from Ukraine, sharing what's happening on the ground in the country, the history of what's happened in the Ukrainian-Russian relationship, where humanity is in its developmental stages, particularly in the European region and the US. And we'll be diving further into that conversation today. And unlike so much of the media, particularly here in the US, where the focus is on supposed fair and balanced, what we strive for here at Humanity Rising is the pursuit of truth. And so it's just such a delight to be hosting the programs this week. Joining us again today, Auke Van Nimwegen from the Netherlands. He grew up in the Netherlands, lived in the US, Australia, and in the 1980s in Poland. From an early age, he was interested in politics and involved in progressive movements against war and discrimination and for social justice, including helping the uprising in Poland and the transition there. He trained as an engineer and has worked for international companies, including Microsoft, and focused the last 25 years on leadership, organization, culture, and social projects. Joining us today is Mikhailo Winchevsky. He's an associate professor in the sociology department at the National University in Kyiv, and an adjunct professor in the business school at the Ukrainian Catholic University. He served as an advisor to the Ukraine's Minister of Education and Science, and in 2019 was appointed head of the Secretariat of Ukraine's National Agency for Higher Education, Quality Assurance. He was awarded a PhD in economic sociology in 2004 from the University of Cambridge in the UK. And during the Revolution of Dignity, he was a regular commentator for English language media outlets and provided analysis on current events in his Thoughts from Kyiv blog. Originally from Canada, he's lived permanently in Kyiv with his wife and 4 children since 2003. And before we bring them into our conversation today, as is our practice, I would just invite everyone to take a moment to ground and let's focus on our breath. And so when Georg brings up the art card, I just invite each of you to take a nice 5.5 second in-breath, and at the sound of the gong, release the breath for about 5.5 seconds. We'll do 10 breaths and then get into today's dialogue. Auke, Mikhailo, welcome to Humanity Rising and today's broadcast. Really looking forward to this conversation, and certainly part of the challenge we have here in the US, and I think most of the world now, is that each of the governments around the world have their own agenda. Here in the US, we've got the State Department, the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Defense. We have the arms and military manufacturing industry that has their own agendas. And so each of those entities have a story, a spin on what is the truth and what's going on, whether it's in Ukraine or someplace else. The Russians have their own communication and propaganda machines. And so trying to find out what is true, what's really happening in the world, what's really happening in the Ukraine, who are the actors. Certainly we know about the millions and millions of people who are suffering. And so really looking forward to today's conversation to try to pursue the truth of what's happening in the world. And Auke, a special thank you to you for organizing this week. So welcome and look forward to the conversation.
Good. Before Mikhailo starts, I just want to also point out that Mikhailo is also Deputy Minister of Education in Ukraine, with a task to reform the higher education there. I promised Katrina I would mention that as an introduction. So I'll leave the next 45 minutes or more to Mikhailo.
Thank you very much for that, but I may actually get in trouble for presenting myself today as a government employee. Please realize that I'm actually talking very much off the record with respect to my government position. I've only been in this position for 7 weeks now, something relatively new for me. I did previously have I've previously been involved, as was mentioned, in something called the National Agency for Higher Education Quality Assurance. In other words, educational reform is not something that is new to me. But I will actually not be talking about educational reform today. I've been asked to do a presentation a little bit about sort of our what we call the rocky road to democracy, and I'm presenting this as a kind of in the context of sort of thinking about Ukraine, and I think that those in the audience that may have heard of a colleague of mine, who I'm proud to call a friend, also by the name of Timothy Snyder. He always talks about the fact that in addition, if we're looking for truth, particularly in history, he's a historian from Yale. He talks about the fact that we need to think about and think with the actual protagonists of history. In other words, trying to get into the shoes of the people that are actually on the ground. So I am someone that has been on the ground. I've been living in Ukraine for the past 20 years, as was said in the introduction. I have four kids, and we've made a career of ourselves. We've done a family, and I've made a career for myself here in Ukraine, having come from Canada originally via the UK, where I spent 4 years doing my graduate work. But I'll actually like to talk a little bit about giving, in the context of giving you actually a little bit of context. Let's put it this way: Ukraine's image prior to 24th of February 2022. When we think about that date, incidentally, has very much been sort of ingrained, I think, in every single Ukrainian's brain at this point. The 24th of February 2022 is the start of the full-scale Russian invasion. But the image of Ukraine in the world prior to that date was not particularly positive. Today, when we think of Ukraine, if we did a sort of an association game, I think many people in the world would probably associate it with Zelensky, would probably associate it with the word resilience, with many other things. But prior to 24th of February, we didn't have that positive image. And that was because of the fact that there was this image of endemic corruption, supposedly oligarchs who controlled everything. We supposedly had this underdeveloped civil society, which of course, except for the fact that once in a while we would blow up at revolutions, and these would be events that would be carried on all global media. But at the end of the day, Ukraine was looked upon as being something a little bit backward. Ukrainians were about systemic dependency, supposedly paternalistic. And very often what we would see is Ukraine would be used as a prefix to crisis. In other words, you would have the Ukraine crisis. I actually, in 2019, decided to look at this from a social science perspective, and I'm grateful to Auke for doing a review of my book. It came out in 2019, was then translated into Ukrainian in 2022. 2021, and it was part of the first series in a series of volumes called Ukrainian Voices, and that series is now, thank you to Andreas Umland, has actually now blossomed into, I think, over 40 books in that series. But the idea here was to try to provide voice to Ukrainians on the ground. So keep in mind, please, that my search for the truth today, as Tom was mentioning, is about trying to give voice, not necessarily to Washington, not to Brussels, certainly not to Moscow, but actually to Kyiv and to a 43 million person population of Ukraine that has lived through not just a war, but actually has lived through a very interesting 30 years of independent history. The first image that I wanted to share with you is an image of something called October Square, or October Revolution Square in the center of Kyiv. It's now known as Independence Square, but back in 1990, it was known as October Revolution Square. And this is our first, if you like, revolution. This was a student-led protest. The students camped out in October of 1990. They camped out for 3 weeks. They called a hunger strike. And effectively, this was the first sort of call for Ukrainian independence. And it was a real shock for the Soviet establishment at the time, because certainly they were not expecting this kind of a grassroots movement, and obviously didn't know what to do with it. And this is in the middle of perestroika. Most things are happening in Moscow. Kyiv is considered to be rather provincial, although quite frankly, it is the third city when it comes to importance in the Soviet Union after Moscow and Leningrad. But nevertheless, it was not a place that people would have expected to see sort of this grassroots agency. I will be using grassroots agency a lot in this presentation, because I think this is something that is very much underappreciated in Ukraine. And when we talk about giving Ukrainians voice, it's always about grassroots and agency. In 2004, those of you that are young enough to remember, we had something called the Orange Revolution, which again, in that same square, now amounted to a very large number of people coming together. Again, we had tents. But in this case, it was about not students specifically, although students were involved. This was more of an election campaign issue, whereby we had a pro-Western candidate by the name of Viktor Yushchenko, who was vying against a pro-Russian candidate by the name of Viktor Yanukovych. And Viktor Yanukovych, with Russian support, decided to basically falsify the elections. The elections were falsified. The second round of the elections was falsified. That was actually determined by the Supreme Court that there was a falsification. But prior to the Supreme Court decision, there was a series of protests on Independence Square. The Supreme Court decision led to a peaceful resolution to the crisis, in that the second round of the election was rerun and Viktor Yushchenko won, not necessarily a resounding victory, which I'll talk about in a second, but nevertheless a victory, and therefore supposedly pushed out Viktor Yanukovych. However, Yanukovych was, not pushed out forever, because in 2013, we see another gathering of people on the Maidan. And this again is that same square. If in the previous shot here, you're looking at probably about 100,000, maybe 150,000 people, I will tell you that it is an absolutely unique experience to be in a crowd of 1 million people. This is what part of a crowd of 1 million people looks like. And somewhere in the center of that picture would be little old me. But unfortunately, you can't see me because it's a little bit too undetailed. Nevertheless, I am not only an analyst, but also a participant in many of the things that are happening in Ukraine, specifically in some of these protests. Now, you would know of this protest in 2013 as something called the Euromaidan. The Euromaidan began as a bit of a party. What it was a student-led protest, which began because of the fact that the Yanukovych government at the time decided to suddenly cancel its decision to sign the association agreement with the European Union. And this brought many students out onto the main square. Interestingly enough, no party platforms, no party flags. The idea was that this was a student-led protest in favor of Europe. Many of my students, as those of you that might read a little bit of Cyrillic, Mohylanka is the pet name for Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, where I teach. Many of my students went out onto the Maidan and were very much active at that time. And I think that they probably appreciated the fact that their professor once in a while would come by and say hello and support them in their protest efforts. There was a significant amount of sort of intellectual, if you like, intellectualization of the Maidan at some point. We actually set up a stage at one point, which was called the Open University of Maidan. But I think it's important to understand that after December 1st, in Ukrainian parlance, we didn't call it the Euromaidan anymore, because it stopped being about Europe the night that 1,253 riot police troops attacked a little less than 300 students that were camped out on the main square. At that point, it became a protest that was a lot more about don't beat our kids. It was about simple things we called dignity. It was about creating a life for our next generation that would not necessarily involve violence, and that would involve free travel, and that would involve free speech, and that would involve a lot of different values that many of us in the West have taken for granted. These turned out to be values that people would actually fight for. The photo that you see on the right here is actually a photo of the first time then in my life that I was a witness personally to someone getting shot. The chap that you see that's gathering, I guess, these orange pylons in the middle of something called no man's land, approximately 3 seconds after I took this picture, was shot by a riot police officer. As you can see, he wasn't a particular threat. Neither were any of the protesters on the Maidan at the time. Nevertheless, the regime believed we were a threat. That ended badly. This was the main building on Independence Square. It's called the Trade Unions Building. That was burned down on February 19th, 2014, when the riot police were ordered to supposedly clear the protesters after 3 months worth of protest. One person was killed, effectively burned alive in that building. And as you can see, the following day, we had a mass funeral for many of those people that died in those days. We mourn them as something called the Heavens 100. In fact, it's 114 people that died in a span of January 19th to February 21st in Ukraine, in something that we call the Revolution of Dignity. My book is obviously a little bit biased because I am involved as not just an analyst, but also, if you like, a participant observer. One of my son's classmates was killed on the Maidan, and he is part of something we call the Nebesna Sotnya, and will always be remembered as simply Sashko Plikhanov. It started off as a big party, quite frankly, because it started off with a protest movement that was going to be very, very peaceful, as other protest movements in Ukraine had always been. In 1990, what we called the Revolution on Granite was peaceful. In 2004, everything was peaceful. In 2013, we were expecting things to be peaceful. In fact, we even celebrated New Year's on the Maidan with a lot of people gathering around. And even though the center of the city was blocked, we were convinced that this was basically a sit-in. This was something where the Yanukovych government was going to finally realize that we were part of Europe and that values are important to the way that we want to live as a people. Unfortunately, the Yanukovych government didn't understand it that way. And so on January 19th, there was our first moment of violence. This was when the riot police decided to actually, well, this was when things got a little out of hand on January 19th. This is the January 19th, incidentally, according to the Orthodox calendar, the traditional Orthodox calendar is the day that priests will bless water. In other words, it's called Jordan's Day. It's the day that in the church calendar, Christ was supposedly baptized by John the Baptist. And this was the day that was called very much sort of the baptism by fire, because for the first time since independence, Ukraine experienced political violence. Ukraine was the only former Soviet republic, including Russia, to never have experienced political violence in the post-Soviet period. Each of the Baltic states, Georgia, had experienced a war. The Russians had experienced the Chechen War plus 1993, the tanks on the streets of Moscow. The Belarusians had experienced political violence. Ukraine had never experienced political violence until January 19th, 2014. That violence continued with activists being kidnapped, beaten in forests around Kyiv, and the climax actually happened on the night of February 18th, so a month later. In that time period, between the first outbreak of violence and February 18th, we had certain incidences that very much proved the fact that the authorities were not interested in the dignity of man. They were not interested in the values that we as protesters and as a population believe to be important. This is an arrested protester who was in minus 15-degree weather, paraded around in front of police officers, stark naked. His name was Kozak Havryluk. It ended on February 18th. This is a very emotional picture for me because the middle-aged gentleman on the left is a professor at Kyiv Polytechnic. His son on the right is a PhD student. They peacefully approached parliament and were beaten. If, for those of you that believe that this was an internal Ukrainian issue, it became very clear in the days immediately following the climax of the protests, when Yanukovych fled Kyiv and eventually ended up in Russia, that much of what was going on in terms of the violence and the crackdowns was in fact staged and instigated from Moscow. In the immediate period after February 19th, on February 21st, we see our first little green men appearing on the Crimean Peninsula. Obviously, Putin states that these have nothing to do with the Russian forces. However, 6 months after the operation, once the Crimean Peninsula had been supposedly illegally, but nevertheless annexed to the Russian Federation, there was a medal that was issued by Putin, by the Kremlin, in thanks to the Russian special services, who were in fact, obviously, annexing the peninsula militarily, and it states from February 20th onward, thank you for your service. In other words, the Yanukovych government had not even yet fallen within Kyiv. Moscow was already moving to annex the Crimean Peninsula. This was followed by supposedly grassroots, but obviously not grassroots, movement of separatism within the Donbass. It's interesting how separatists would get their hands on tanks. That ended badly with several battles, which obviously saw not only our first action in terms of formal military activity, but also our first casualties. What I think is very important to understand is that by July of 2014, we weren't, in fact, I mean, the propaganda was showing that supposedly this was an uprising in the Donbass, that these were supposedly local miners that were fighting for the sake of their own independence, not agreeing with the protesters in Kyiv. But in fact, we have, first of all, the issue of a fellow by the name of Hirkin, who occupied Slovyansk. In fact, he was, and is to this day, known to be a Russian special services officer. In addition, we had the shoot down of the MH17, in other words, Malaysian Airlines flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, killing 300 people on board, all 300 people on board. That was shot down with a Russian, what's called Buk missile. And what was, I think, most important is within the August period, this is something that unfortunately is not really talked about in the narrative about Ukraine. We actually had our first battle with Russian regular troops. That is called the Battle of Ilovaisk. That engaged approximately 2,500 Ukrainian troops facing approximately 7,000 troops from the Russian side. Obviously, it did not end well. The Ukrainian troops were not well trained. They were not prepared for battle. And when they attempted to withdraw, supposedly they had a deal to provide a humanitarian corridor from the Russian side. But in fact, the Russians basically shot them in what we would in the US call a turkey shoot. That resulted in our first mass casualties. And to this day, the Battle of Ilovaisk is considered to be really the start of an open war between Russia and Ukraine. Prior to that, it was always supposedly somehow hidden behind special forces, etc. In this particular case, we're talking about Russian regulars with tanks and artillery on Ukrainian ground, on Ukrainian territory, invading, and I'll remind you, this is August of 2014. So the reaction to on the Ukrainian side is a series of volunteer battalions. The Ukrainian armed forces at the moment of the attack by the Russians counted, according to many estimates, approximately 5,000 battle-ready troops. In other words, Ukraine was not expecting an attack from Russia. Many of the Ukrainian forces, meaning the Ukrainian command structure, including special forces, including security services, including police forces, were in fact infiltrated, if not by actual Russian citizens, then certainly by Russian sympathizers. The interesting reaction that we see in 2014 and 15 is a grassroots mobilization of young people, of business people that begin to finance, using their own money, using non-state funds, effectively volunteer battalions. Now, by the middle of 2015, each of these volunteer battalions, including the supposedly notorious, and the reason I say notorious is because Russian propaganda has made it out to be a supposedly right-wing Nazi type of grouping called Azov, which has very little to do with, I mean, obviously the initial patriots that were involved in this, in the formation of that armed group may have had questionable, made questionable choices when it comes to their symbolism, but to call these people sort of right-wing Nazis or something like that is obviously to fall into the trap of Russian propaganda. What this was a movement towards defending your country. The country had been attacked in 2014. It was obvious that much of the violence that was perpetrated in Kyiv in 2014 was in fact staged. It was staged in order to create an image in the West of Ukraine being a failed state that supposedly had a civil war on its hands and heavy cleavages. Nothing of the sort, nothing even close to that narrative would have been true. And the testament to that is the mass mobilization of people to defend their country. Many people did not, in fact, mobilize militarily. Many mobilized in terms of volunteering, so providing, for example, flak jackets, helmets, water, supplies, first aid kits, all sorts of night vision goggles, and basically taking mothballed military equipment that had very often been mothballed from the 1960s and 1970s and trying to bring it back into service in order to counter the Russian invasion. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of things, and I apologize for being a little bit perhaps here academic, but nevertheless, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an analysis in addition to the chronicle that I've just provided of the revolution, but also a bit of an analysis in terms of what dimensions of revolution and what dimensions we should be talking about. One is, of course, the national dimension. And I think that this I've already mentioned, the concept of moving the discourse from Euromaidan to something we called the Revolution of Dignity. And the reason it became a Revolution of Dignity is because it was about the dignity of the person. It was about the ability or the right of every individual to be able to protest, to be able to say that what's on their mind, to be able to show the symbolism that they want to show, and have enough and be respected for that. In other words, have the dignity that we take for granted as human beings. But in addition to that, there's also the national dimension. In other words, this is something that I think was a very good phrase. A friend of mine is a journalist, Katya Horczynska, wrote, "In searching for Europe, we found Ukraine." And this was a sort of a dignity of belonging to a group. Personal identity revolution was very much present. We saw people, as we see today, switching languages. Russian and Ukrainian were very much used interchangeably. Kyiv was a city, and still largely remains that way, although much less so in the last year. But for the 20 years that I lived here, from 2002 to the beginning of the full-scale invasion, it was a normal thing that one person would talk in Ukrainian, another would answer back in Russian, and you would have a kind of a bilingual conversation. Over the last 7 years, more and more people have made a choice to switch to Ukrainian because they've identified Russian as being the language of the aggressor, of the oppressor, of the imperialist power that is not about dignity. I think that there's a crucial importance of symbolism in all of the things that we see in the protest movement. This idea of modernizing old historical symbols, like the Cossacks, like the flag, like the anthem. I think I've never sang the national anthem as often as I had during the protest movement. We see this continuing, this sort of mass mobilization and patriotism continues after 2014 and is very much present in 2022 and onwards today. But it's an inclusive kind of patriotism. It's very often we see patriotism as somehow, the word patriotism is somehow equated with nationalism. Well, not in the Ukrainian case. It's about it's not ethno-nationalism, about sort of being Ukrainian ethnically, because part of the Ukrainian nation are the Crimean Tatars, and they are non-Christian. They tend to be Muslims. They tend to also have a different, if you like, physical appearance than sort of I guess the normal, if you would want to call it that in quotation marks, white Ukrainian. So they speak a different language. They have a different religion. But nevertheless, Crimean Tatars are very much part of the Ukrainian nation. We have today a president who happens to be Jewish. And I think that that's also something that's very important for us to understand, that patriotism is not necessarily the same thing as nationalism. Yes, we do have nationalist groups in Ukraine, as we do in every European country. But I think that what I think is fascinating is the fact that they are so few, and in comparison to many of our European colleagues, in fact, represent a much smaller percentage of the population than you would see in other countries. One of the things that we see in Ukraine's history is a change of voting patterns, and much of this is made. Been made of this when we talk about the Ukrainian history of supposedly being a Western Ukrainian language or linguistically Ukrainian Western region versus a supposedly Russian linguistically region in the East. When we look at the elections of 1996, 1993, we see Leonid Kuchma, Leonid Kravchuk, and this would be sort of the dividing line. And then we move forward into another series of elections, 2004, and then again in 2010, and we see a sort of a definite divide regionally between East and West. And so it's not surprising that the interpretation very often in the discourse about Ukraine is that this is supposedly an endemically divided country around linguistic lines. Now, I will point out that by 2014, when we have our next election, those lines are gone. Poroshenko wins hands down in the first round across Ukraine. Zelensky in 2019 won again without a regional differentiation. So I think it is important that linguistic hypothesis may have existed in the past, but as a result of the revolution and then the following Russian aggression, that linguistic pattern is gone. And we see it in something that really surprises a lot of people that are observers of Ukraine. Supposedly, the idea was that the blue part is the predominantly Russian-speaking area, and the yellow or orange part is supposedly the predominantly Ukrainian-speaking area. Although, as someone who actually speaks both languages, I will tell you that this is an extreme simplification, because the languages are very often mixed. It's kind of a pidgin. We call it surzik in a lot of areas of Ukraine. So it's a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian. And by the way, quite similar to something that me as a Canadian, I would identify with as Quebecois, because we see very often a mixture of languages in many areas of the world. But I think what is most surprising to a lot of observers of 2014 and onwards is something that we call the Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriot. And this is a phenomenon that is absolutely fascinating. No one was really expecting it until such time as Putin attacked. And when Putin attacked, when Russia actually invaded, suddenly the issue of language became not only not important, it became not only second, it was thrown out to be something completely unimportant, because the territory of Ukraine had been attacked. And I stress the fact that it was attacked in 2014. In March, Crimea was illegally annexed. In August of 2014, we had our first battle between Ukrainian regulars and Russian regular army forces at Ilovaisk. The second dimension that I wanted to talk about is this concept of, if you like, post-industrial, bourgeois, etc. And this is an interesting one, because it's not just about protests on the streets. One of the questions that was very often asked of me is, who is financing the protesters? Because in the Russian narrative of 2004, 10 years prior, was that this was supposedly a CIA plot, that somehow the Americans were financing everything. My answer to that one was, I wish I knew where to get my cut. But unfortunately, I didn't get a cut, and neither did any of the other protesters there, because the Maidan and the protests of 2013-14, like the volunteer battalions afterwards, like the grassroots movements of 2022, which I'll talk about in just a second, were financed by local business people. And this is an interesting one, because what we're talking about is very often not large businesses, but small and medium businesses. People who had cars to deliver to protesters, people who could deliver food to the protesters. The demand was for representative leadership, not for governance, not for someone to tell me what to do, but in fact, sort of, if you like, I want my government to represent me. And that meant an appeal for something that was very much a sort of to a large extent, looked like kind of anarchic. Because it was not about leaders. Whenever the nominal opposition leaders, the ones that were elected as opposition leaders, would actually get up on the stage of Maidan and start talking to the people, I always got the impression that it was questionable whether the protesters actually trusted them any more than they trusted the Yanukovych government, because it was very much about a leaderless movement. It was about not trusting anybody that was in politics. This was very much a sort of a revolution, if you like, of meritocracy, not about a scriptive hierarchy. It's something that Richard Florida has been very good about talking about in the North American context, called the creative class. People that don't like working in working or living, in fact, in hierarchies, in sort of in rules-based type economies. Very much about meritocratic, make your own rules sort of thing, highly suspicious of the state. And I would even say that in many cases, a little bit libertarian in their program. And this is something that is interesting, because if you think about that, we were calling it the Euro Maidan, and European Union is very much about social market. And these people that are protesting under very often European flags are in fact proclaiming something that would be, well, quite frankly, not very European when it comes to economic type programs. Nevertheless, they were talking about values, and dignity is something that I think is much more fundamental than economic or social policies. There's a following dimension that I do mention in the book, and I just want to say it very, very briefly. Something that I call the postmodern dimension, because this was about formation of new senses. Revolutions are not, we very often think about revolutions as being sort of class-based, but there's another way of looking at revolutions, and that is that they create conceptual novelty. For those of you that are versed in political sciences, you know that I'm talking about Hannah Arendt, who talked about revolutions being, at the end of the day, a conceptual event rather than a class event. Dignity is very much about relations. It's not compatible very much with the concept of individual. It's compatible with the idea of we rather than I, right? So dignity is a concept that is very much not about individualism, but it comes from a concept in philosophy that we call personalism. So we emphasize the significance and uniqueness and inviolability of the person, as well as the essentially relational, or if you like, communitarian dimension of that person. So the idea basically was about sanctity of individual rights, but with collective responsibility, which is a little bit strange, because when we talk about individualism and collectivism, these are normally considered to be sort of polar opposites. But in fact, in this case, we're seeing a fight for individual rights. Don't beat my kids, but it's about we coming out on the streets, and it's about we demanding our dignity. Concept of natural justice, and this also has to do with this concept of depersonalized charisma and the leaderless agency. If someone's interested in talking about that during the Q&A period, I'll be happy to look at that a little bit more. I do want to say a couple of words though about what we're seeing in 2022, because I think that the reason that we talk about the Revolution of Dignity of 2014 is because it does create a little bit of an explanation of where did these Ukrainians come from, right? Because I think many in the West were asking themselves after February 24th, 2022, the statement is wonderful in New York. I thought I knew what bravery was, and then I saw Ukraine. I think that many people were not expecting to see the kind of resilience that Ukrainians actually showed. Interestingly enough, Ukrainians weren't surprised at all. We knew full well that our president was not going to be running away. We knew full well that we have multiple experiences in grassroots movements. So territorial defense and peaceful resistance is something that is very much part of, if you like, a Ukrainian identity. I'm not going to say it's part of the DNA, because that would be a little bit strange for a sociologist to say. But nevertheless, the idea is that this is very much part of the socialization of Ukrainians. Volunteer logistics, entrepreneur networks, total support for the armed forces. I wrote something at the beginning of the invasion about Ukrainians being bees. This apparently sort of went kind of viral at the time. Ukrainians are very much like a beehive. If you know anything about bees, you know that it's a very non-hierarchical kind of system. I think that also it's very important that the Kremlin, when Putin invaded, he invaded with a narrative that was very much historical focused. In other words, it was about supposedly the Russians and Ukrainians being one people, which obviously historically false, but nevertheless something that could be presented as a justification for war, apparently looking for a recapturing of this golden age, which could be defined as the 19th century or perhaps the 20th century, the Soviet Union. Doesn't matter where you define it. The point is that it's always past focused. Whereas Ukrainians are very much about future outlook, and I'm always very surprised by this. But I mean, one of the most popular things that we've been doing over the last year is running a series of conferences and talking constantly about strategizing Ukraine after the war. And this is something that's done by civil society. It's something that's supported by the government. It's something that we have massive discussions in social networks about how we see Ukraine developing as soon as victory happens. And it's almost to the point of victory is taken as for granted, right? Because obviously Ukraine will take back its territory, and then eventually we will build the society that we in fact want to build, regardless of the various problems in our history that, quite frankly, are the same as any other country would have. This war is not about language, and I think that's very important to say. It's not about language. It never has been about language. The most people that are dying in this war are Russian-speaking Ukrainians. The primary area of contention at the moment, the South and the East, are the places where we have the largest number of Russian speakers. So if Putin really was about, protecting Russian speakers, then he shouldn't be killing them. and whereas he's killing them en masse. This war is about Ukraine and Ukrainians, and I think it's important to realize that we are fighting it. It will be won by us. We are grateful for every single piece of artillery, every single weapon, every single artillery shell, every single piece of defensive capability that we are receiving from our friends. But at the end of the day, it's our war to win. And I think we all realize that. We have an eternal question. And Auke asked me to talk about this a little bit more. I've already talked a little bit. I will talk a little bit more about this idea of identity, because I think every single course on Ukraine that I've ever come upon happens to always start with identity. So let's talk about identity. Supposedly the West wants to go west, the East wants to go east, the West wants to be nationalistic, the East wants to be with the Soviet Union or recreating it. And in the middle, we have this Cossack, traditional Ukrainian symbol of our independence that's sitting there going, why should I go in either direction? And I think I've talked about this a little bit. I think this is an important slide. I'm not going to try to kill you with statistics here, but I think that there is one thing that we need to realize. In 2013 and 2014, we had a series of representative polls taken in a variety of different areas of Ukraine. And I think one of the most interesting things that we see is the massive growth in the number of people over 6 months between these polls that are identifying themselves as citizens of Ukraine. The question was, how do you identify yourself in the first place? And the massive number of people that identify themselves in 2013-14 as citizens of Ukraine. The unfortunate fact is that in the Donbass, and this was the last poll that was able to be taken in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass, before those areas were basically separated from the country, we had a very large proportion of people that would identify themselves, and an increasing number that would identify themselves as the resident of the group of the region that they lived in, or as citizens of the former USSR. So I'm not going to try to convince you that there was no separatist forces within Ukraine. There was certainly in the East, there would have been large numbers of people that would have been fans of Yanukovych, that would have, because he was from the Donbass, that would have obviously not agreed with the protest movements in Kyiv, but it is questionable whether those people would in fact have taken up arms had they not been provoked into that by the Russians. I think it's extremely important looking at 2022, take a look at the statistics. So the number of people that would identify themselves as citizens of Ukraine in 2022 before the invasion was 64%. Immediately after the invasion comes to 84%. So in other words, we have, one of the things that we laugh about this in Ukraine a little bit, but I guess one of the people that we have to thank for creating a patriotic Ukrainian nation, not for creating a nation, but for creating a patriotic Ukrainian nation, is Putin, because he's the one that is the cause of the aggression that Ukrainians have been feeling for the last 8 or 9 years. This is a strange identity construct, this Ukrainian thing. It's not ethno-linguistic. It includes non-Ukrainian speakers. And at the same time, these non-Ukrainian speakers en masse support a single Ukrainian state language. In other words, they will speak other languages at home, Crimean Tatar, Russian, Yiddish, Hebrew, Bulgarian, Hungarian, many other languages, but yet they will always state, a vast majority will state, that the Ukrainian language should be the single language of the state. And this is, in fact, what we're seeing is a not very large difference in the way that what you see is in 2021-22, you're seeing a shift of people that would identify themselves as Ukrainian speakers, but it's not a huge shift. It's a 5% shift over basically a 2-year period. And yes, that is as a result of people switching from Russian into Ukrainian. But we still have a very large proportion of people, and in fact, growing proportion of people that speak both Russian and Ukrainian at home. And that's fine. That's absolutely, I think that what we're talking about is a sort of a territorial nation. if you want to insult a Ukrainian, here's a recipe for you. Draw a map without Crimea. That is probably the greatest insult that you can provide to a Ukrainian. You know, I'm going to be Tom. Hopefully you won't find this offensive, but I think it's an equivalent to having an American see their flag burned. Okay, it's something that touches upon some really emotional notes for Ukrainians. Crimea is Ukraine, always has been Ukraine. It's a symbol of our territory and our home. The concept of a territorial nation is something that's very important. I do want to say a couple of words about the unexpected success of the Ukrainian forces, because in fact, these are very much a continuation of some of the ideas and things that we've seen in the Revolution of Dignity. Obviously, the success of the forces has been because of the fact that we've had high-tech weapons. Again, thank you to our friends in the West for providing them. Yes, patriotic idealism has been important. Kremlin misread Ukraine. The Soviet Union is in fact dead. There's no chance of recreating it because Ukrainians want nothing to do with that vision of empire. But there is a final one, and that has to do with organizational structure. And I think it's something that's very interesting because we saw this in the Maidan protests. I use the word grassroots agency. In the Russian Federation armed forces, we see massive corruption, and we also see a hierarchical force. What we see in the Ukrainian armed forces is what the American general General McChrystal has written about, called team of teams. In other words, it's about small group tactics. It's about leaderless agency. It's about people coming together as volunteers, mobilizing and getting the job done, not necessarily worrying too much about where the specific orders come from. Obviously, orders are given, but orders are in a very sort of a general way, move in that direction rather than what to do on the battlefield. I think it's extremely important also to state that the vision of Ukraine as corrupt, which was very much promulgated and proliferated prior to 2022, and I think is still latent in much of the discourse about Ukraine, was just plain wrong. According to generally accepted views, Ukrainian and political economic system continues to be somehow non-transparent, patronal, etc. The assumption is that if you are not Western, you are not modern. In fact, what we're seeing something that is, I would even call it post-modern, perhaps post-Western. Personalized teams, limited hierarchy, flexible rules, creative class entrepreneurs that are paying their own money to defend their country, to defend the values in which they believe. Kyiv is the capital of freedom has been a very, very mobilizing kind of slogan, I think. And this is about, again, the book that I was talking about General McChrystal. Ukraine's sort of heterarchic structure, we call that when it's not hierarchic, it's sort of a grassroots movement. It's been proven to be extremely effective. It regulates the interaction among members of society, providing guidelines within cultural norms for achieving the goals defined by values. We have a history of this. The Ukrainians in the audience will certainly recognize this image of the Ukrainian frontier warrior, the Cossack. Interestingly enough, in the First World War, we had a continuation of that. Again, Ukrainians in the audience will recognize Makhno, fascinating character in Ukrainian history, who at one point in time organized supposedly an army of 100,000 men under the, listen to me carefully, 100,000 men under the flag of anarchy. An army of 100,000 men under the flag of anarchy. Right? It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it happened. And then after it was done, they all went home. It's kind of a very typically Ukrainian thing to do. We see a lot of this movement, grassroots, mobilization, skepticism of leaders, something that is very much part of the Ukrainian culture, if you like, during the Maidan, immediately after the Maidan, and strangely enough, in Ukrainian IT companies. But I can talk about that one, I guess, on a separate occasion. So the secret sauce of Ukraine is about social structure. It's about learning to herd cats. we seem to have a kind of a habitus that the world needs. It's kind of an analogy to, if you like, one of the things that I put forth in my book is kind of an analogy to Max Weber's thesis on the roots of industrial society. This was because of the fact that the Dutch Protestants had this ethic that comes from Calvinism. And that's why modern society began on the outskirts of Europe, in a very cold and damp place called the Netherlands. Post-industrial society is about hierarchy. It's idealistic. It's diffused agency. Some would call it anarchic. It's about agile as opposed to sort of normal project planning. I think that we have something to teach the rest of the world. And this is perhaps something that makes, to me, important. It's an important thing to say because I think it makes a difference to say that, you know, this war, it's not about territory. It's not just about territory, I should say. It's not just about the fact that Ukrainians want to be free of imperialism, of a Russian domination. Ukrainians have something to offer to the world as well. And we've proven it over the last 8 years in something that we call hierarchic structures. And these require new institutions, new approaches to leadership, collective decision-making. Technology is important, but there's a lot of things that we need to experiment with after the war is over. We need to get our country back, and then we will build something new that will in fact be interesting to the rest of the world as well. I'm going to end with a relatively long quote by a friend of mine by the name of Yaroslav Hrycak. He's a wonderful historian. He talks about the fact that Ukrainian society is structured horizontally. And this is how our army is fighting as well. Recently, I overheard a discussion between two Western military experts. They were discussing what would have happened if during the first days of the invasion, Zelensky had been killed by a Russian recon unit. Their conclusion, this would have been a huge tragedy, but it would not have lessened the Ukrainians' chances of victory because every mayor, every local leader acts like a little president, making decisions without waiting for orders from above. The Ukrainian army is different from the Russian army. We take initiative. We're flexible. In the Russian army, decisions that in our case are made by junior officers, there require a general. And this explains why the Russians have lost a comparatively large number of generals in this war, and they need to be close to the front to make decisions. In our case, the threat is existential, and this gives rise to strong feelings of solidarity and love. And perhaps it sounds a bit strange, I would even say a little bit corny, but Ukraine today is a country of love. We've never loved our homeland as much as now. We have a war to win. Ukrainians are bees. Bees won't sting you unless you threaten them. They'll even share their honey. Bees work. Bees thrive when the land is covered with yellow blossoms and the sky above is blue. For those of you that missed the symbolism, that's the colors of the flag. If you're a bear, sticking your claws into a beehive is a bad idea. Bees that are defending their hive need no instructions. Each takes responsibility and is very, very effective. It's a bad idea to go after a beehive. It's also a bad idea to ask for peace because, quite frankly, the hive needs to be protected. And until such time as the hive has been reinstated, to talk about peace is to not honor every single person or every single bee who sacrificed for the sake of the hive. I'll end with that. Thanks very much, and hopefully there will be some questions and discussion.
Wonderful information, Mikhailo. Thank you for being here and bringing the historical context, the social context, and the just your personal connection to what's been happening in your country for the last 20 years. Thank you. It's a true gift. Before we get into the conversation, I mean, one of the questions that's been on my mind for the last 20 years is that historically, history's been written by the victors. And with the introduction of the internet, there was an opportunity that seems to be increasingly lost, that the writing of history was going to be democratized. But with artificial intelligence, with a lot of the manipulation of social media, I'm not sure, not only about history, but even current news, where to go for an accurate depiction of history and accurate depiction of facts. And so I just want to bring that into part of our conversation today. And we've had some wonderful questions coming into the chat, but let's get into a dialogue and see where we want to take the conversation. Auke, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michaela, for your presentation. I also want to say, my personal encounter with Ukrainians has increased a lot in the last year because quite a few of them have fled to the Netherlands, and it is, the defiance you're talking about has been astonishing in every single person that I've met. So I haven't met any Ukrainians that don't sort of fall into that category. So maybe I've just been lucky to meet a selected few, but yeah. One of the first questions I want to that was there, Nick is asking, can you please address the large number of people who were compelled to flee the Russian occupied territories in 2014 and other areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, people were fleeing violence on the one hand, and the other thing is first of all, I think it's important to make a distinction between Crimea and the Russian occupied territories of the East, meaning what came to be known as the Donetsk and Luhansk, supposedly People's Republics. The people that came to power in the East, in Donetsk and Luhansk, were supposedly separatists. In fact, were in the large majority part of organized crime. In other words, this was very much about thugs coming to power. Thugs that were receiving large amounts of money from Russia, thugs that were receiving large amounts of military equipment from Russia, and that were effectively trying to create a sort of an image of this local separatist kind of movement. Many people fled from that. Donetsk became a city that was once thriving of over 1 million people. I have some very good friends that are from Donetsk. I used to go to Donetsk 2-3 times a year. Used to do some teaching there. Donetsk became a city of about 250,000. In other words, you had 3/4 of the population that simply left. Many of those people did not necessarily leave because their homes were destroyed specifically, but their lives were threatened, and their businesses were certainly threatened, and their livelihood was threatened. Now, the reason I say that is because in Crimea, the situation was a little bit different. It wasn't portrayed as being a supposedly separatist kind of movement. This was, in fact, a Russian occupation, where we had very specific FSB, former KGB, if you like, police forces that would crack down on people that were non-Russian speakers, people that were Crimean Tatars, people that did not support the Russian regime. So there it would have been institutionalized terror, if you like, as opposed to the Donbass, where it was less institutionalized and much more thuggish. The internally displaced people of 2014 counted over 1 million. In other words, people from the East and from Crimea that left into Ukraine. And we had obviously we've had a great many more internally displaced and refugees outside of the country over the last year and a half. Hopefully I've commented on answered the question. If I didn't get it right, Auke, maybe you can help me with it.
I think that's a good clarification. Okay, so another question comes up. The name Hunter Biden gets mentioned, right? And I will. So, can you say a few words? And obviously, the name Newland is circulating in the U.S. So what I see in I think more in the U.S. than in Europe, but there is this idea that somehow the U.S. was intervening in 2014, and that's through this one phone call that is being monitored, and the situation around Hunter Biden. Can you? Obviously you already commented on that. You made that very clear about what the situation was, but can you particularly respond to, I would say, those memes that are circulating?
Okay, well, let's break about two things. One is the Victoria Nuland issue. Victoria Nuland was speaking on her telephone on an open line cell phone and made some comments when she was asked about who are the snipers on the Maidan and who does the United States support, etc. And she was making some comments on an open line with respect to the opposition leaders, because there were three opposition leaders who the United States would like to have seen in power after the revolution. Interestingly enough, that person did not get into power. So the U.S., even if the U.S. was responsible for some sort of a conspiracy, wasn't particularly successful because the U.S. was Nuland was saying that she would have liked to have seen Arseniy Yatsenyuk as president. Arseniy Yatsenyuk became a prime minister for a brief period of time, but was not particularly successful, and then was replaced. So I think that this conspiracy theory. It also comes to the fact of, if she was talking on a cell phone about who the U.S. would support in some sort of a post-revolution government, the question becomes who has the capabilities of cracking cell phones that are cell phone conversations coming from American diplomats in Kyiv. And I don't think that that's something that normally non-governmental organizations have the capability of doing. In other words, one would sort of question as to where this leak is coming from. But the fact that diplomats are talking about their political preferences, I think, is nothing particularly strange or new. With respect to Hunter Biden, look, the reality is that we had he certainly did have, and this is quite openly talked about. He had business interests in a company called Burisma, which is some sort of an energy company in Ukraine. I'm not particularly familiar with it as to what it is all about. We understand that there were phone calls going back and forth from President Trump to President Zelensky at one point, asking President Zelensky to open an investigation into Hunter Biden. President Zelensky refused to do so for two reasons. First of all, he didn't control at the time and doesn't control the prosecution's office, which, as in any democracy, is an independent office. And secondly, I think that this has more to do with the question of why was the American president trying to influence internal decisions in a Ukrainian in a foreign country. So I think I'm not sure that I want to be partisan in this case in trying to sort of question as to why why is there an interest of the president's son in a Ukrainian company? I really don't know. Why is the former president, when he was in office, calling a sitting president who had just been elected and asking for a favor is another question I think that also needs to be asked. I think that those questions are really questions perhaps that need to be asked first and foremost by American voters rather than by Ukrainians at this case, if that's okay with you.
As a North American, would you agree that the idea within North America about the US influence abroad is much larger than it really is? Because I mean, we've had these conversations also with Jim around NATO, and his statement was, well, NATO is controlled by the US, which I'm sure the Ukrainians would love that was the case, because now then you would have been actually a NATO member, you would have never had this war. But can you?
I'm not sure we would have never had this war. I'm not sure I agree with you. We'd never had this war, but yes, being a NATO country would certainly have tested Article 5 much sooner than it has been tested. You're right. Look, I think that much too much is made. How much
influence does the US have in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think much too much is made of US influence in Ukraine. And I think one of the points I was trying to get at in my presentation was, look, each time you talk about American conspiracies or American influence or any other external influence in Ukraine, you are denigrating Ukrainian agency. You are stating that Ukrainians, in fact, don't matter, But what matters are these supposedly, large forces, I don't know, conspiratorial, CIA, Zionist conspiracy. Think of some other crock. At the end of the day, it's Ukrainians that are fighting the war. It's Ukrainians that protested against Russian invasion and Russian meddling in their country. There is ample evidence of Russian meddling in Ukraine. As far as the U.S. interests, well, quite frankly, they are pretty minimal in Ukraine. And I'm reading one of the comments here in the chat. Ukraine is not an economically interesting country for the U.S. The U.S. in fact has very, very few investments in Ukraine. The U.S. portion of the U.S. influence on Ukraine's GDP has traditionally been extremely small. Ukraine is in fact a country that is very much sort of between the European Union and Russia economically, as with any other country trading with China. The US trades with China in massive amounts. The European Union trades with China. China is a big trading partner. So it is in Ukraine as well. But if we actually look at the economic independence of Ukraine, meaning the dependence of the economy on internal production, on internal consumption, it is probably one of the most independent countries, economically independent and self-sufficient, in fact, in the world. It's obviously a very large grain exporter and very large food exporter in general, but in fact not the number one provider of food, which is again something that we believe. It is the breadbasket of Europe, but it is not necessarily the number one provider of food in the world. In fact, Russia is in terms of grain. And then, if I'm not mistaken, Canada is second, and then Ukraine is third. If I have my numbers correctly, the only place that we are actual leaders, 100%, is we are the largest producer of sunflower oil in the world. So that is clearly a reason for American imperialism.
Yeah, it's actually the US which is the biggest food exporter in the world.
There you go.
The Dutch are second.
Oh, so there you go.
Yeah. That's a whole different story for another day. Okay, I think we have got to address this point of peace talks with Russia. Right. So, what is your take on this? So, the question here is: did you consider peace before the Russian invasion? I'm not quite sure what the context of the question is, because it's actually Russia that attacked. But
I think that the question is
maybe you can comment a bit on, what are the possibilities of peace talk, because we're in this community of people who, of course, all of us want peace, and particularly within this community, there's a really strong longing for harmony and peace, and of course that's a lot easier from our Western perspective, being in a peaceful environment. How does that look from a Ukrainian perspective, and what possibilities do you see for talks with Russia?
Look. First of all, Ukrainians had a peaceful relationship with Russia until 2014. Ukraine basically disarmed completely until 2014. And this was one of the reasons that we were not able to counter the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. Because as I mentioned, we had approximately 5,000 battle-ready troops against the second largest army in the world. That was annexing our territory. So if we want to look at peace, as I mentioned also, Ukraine is the only country until 2014 in the post-Soviet space that had never had political violence. So peace is something that is extremely important to the Ukrainian values, culture, etc. I will remind you that Ukrainian territory and Ukrainians as a nation are the nation that suffered the most in the Second World War. The Germans came in, the Soviets came back, and each time we had something called the Bloodlands. Prior to that, we had the 1930s and what we call the Holodomor, the man-made famine. We had the Great Terror by Stalin. We had the 1939 to 1945, the massive movements of people and the massive deaths. And this is unfortunately something that I, as a North American who went through school in Canada, realized that the history books in the North American environment are a little bit skewed, because we talk a lot about the Western Front, we talk a lot about the war in the Pacific, but we miss the fact that, hey, 70% of the casualties were on the territory of what is today Ukraine. And it is not the Russians that won the war, it is the Ukrainians in the Soviet army that suffered, and obviously it is their victory to claim. But the Ukrainians have a memory of war, and it is not a pleasant memory of war. Ukrainians are very much a peaceful people. So in 2014, we had part of our territory annexed. We tried to fight some of it back, and we were successful in Donbass a little bit. By 2015, we understood that we were not able to counter the Russian offensive. The Russians, again, in a place called Debaltseve in 2015, inserted the regular army. And at that point, we had something called the Minsk Accords. And President Poroshenko signed a peace agreement in the Minsk Accords. And basically from 2015 to 2022, plus minus, we would have occasional skirmishes across a line of contention, but basically casualties would be 1-2 a month. In other words, it would be a kind of a frozen conflict, warmish kind of war, until 2022, when the Russians decided a full-scale invasion, including Kyiv, bombing all of the entire country, etc. So we had issues. I'm seeing Paul asking me to talk about Minsk. I will talk about that a little bit. As with any peace agreement, it was not something that satisfied either side. The Russians were insisting that we change our constitution, that we supposedly recognize the independence, or at least the sovereignty of these terrorist republics in the East, that we give them effectively veto power on Ukrainian foreign policy. These were the things that were required by the Russian invader at the time, and that had to be agreed to because of the fact that the Ukrainians wanted peace. Zelensky came to power with a statement of, I will bring you peace. He won the election by positioning himself as a peacemaker, as opposed to Poroshenko, who was about continuing in some sort of a warmish kind of conflict. Obviously, things worked out rather differently. Ukrainians today have very little appetite for peace, simply because of the fact that too much has been lost. At the same time, I think that we will get to a point where we will not be able to continue to fight. In other words, we are fighting at the moment in a tactic that is trying to conserve Ukrainian lives. And that tactic requires a lot of help from our Western friends. High-tech weaponry, a lot of artillery, a lot of rockets, a lot of drones. And I think after some time, you folks are going to tell us, you know, it's probably time to stop. And that will probably cause some problems internally in terms of Ukrainian politics, because a lot has been lost. And until such time as we regain our territory, the war will not be over. So the war, I can see us moving towards a sort of a Korean-style ceasefire for a time period. But I also believe that the Russian Empire, as an empire, does not have a future. And that we saw this recently with Prigozhin, and we will see other seams and cleavages of the Russian Empire falling apart. And so the war will eventually end when the Russian Federation stops being a threat against Ukraine.
Yeah, so
Maybe it's also
picking up on that point, you know, the approach that Russia has been taking as in just absolutely horrendous scorched earth policy, violating all kinds of international standards and requirements and expectations around what is it? Not that there's any warfare that's appropriate, but the indiscriminate killing of people, the destroying of cities, matched against this Ukrainian passion for retaining your land, reclaiming your land. It sounds like an absolutely horrible recipe for everyone involved. And so I appreciate your perspective that, you know, the support of the West, and, you know, making sure that the Ukrainian peoples are appropriately armed with technology, but that process of getting to some kind of resolution in this, it just sounds like hell on earth.
It is. It is hell on earth in many places. The scorched earth, as you put it. You know, many of the questions in the chat just now have been talking about killing women and children. I was witness to certain things that have happened over the last year and a half, and I am a father of 4 children, 3 of whom are girls, 14, 16, and 18. And you know, there's trauma that's in them that is not going to go away anytime soon. They've witnessed mass rape. They've witnessed incarceration. They've seen Russian soldiers do what Russian soldiers do. And frankly, to equate anything that the Ukrainians are doing and to talk of peace very often without justice is to blame the victim. And that's something that Ukrainians are not going to stand for. We are the victims in this war, and we demand justice. There was a question, if you don't mind, I'm sorry for jumping in here, but there was a question that was now asked in both the chat and the Q&A, and it comes from Leo. And there's a question to talk about this, the comparison with the Solidarity movement in Poland. When I was writing my book, I very much used Timothy Garton Ash and his book on solidarity in Poland and the Solidarity Revolution as a guide. And I think that there certainly are many comparisons to be made. However, Poland didn't experience an invasion. So when we talk about a revolution, there are a lot of things, including the last phrase that Timothy ends his book with was a quote from a Polish dock worker who says, "You need to understand this was a revolution of the soul." And I use that phrase also in my book because I think this is really what the Revolution of Dignity was about. It was about senses and soul and things that are very much about who we are as humans. And the other side has come in and negated our humanity. And that's what really makes this war very black and white for me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point also here. Yesterday, we started our talk with reminding people of how important our freedom is to us in the West. And I think that it's really good to remind everybody that what Ukrainians are fighting for is what we have, you know, what we take for granted. It's not. It's not. This is not a geopolitical thing, although geopolitics are involved. You know, this is really in a way the way I see it, and you interested to hear your comment on that. This is where Russian totalitarianism is meeting the democracy, and I loved the dignity that you're talking about, because that goes way beyond the values that at least the West has been giving to the world, right? So we try to give it to ourselves, but we haven't necessarily shared it with the world. How do you see that?
Look, I think that one of the things that when we talk about dignity is dignity also is a corollary. The corollary of dignity is responsibility. We have a claim towards dignity, but we are responsible for ourselves. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that that Ukrainians have this idea of grassroots mobilization, because we're taking responsibility for ourselves. We are grateful for the help that is being provided, but I cannot repeat this enough. This is our war to win. And we are thankful, we're grateful, but it's us that has to fight, because we have to get through this. It's our responsibility. And all we can say is thank you. But it's not your decision as to when we sue for peace. It's not your conspiracy that is somehow moving Ukrainians as puppets. It's not it's not up to Biden. It's not up to Charles. Certainly not up to Sunak. It's not up to NATO. It's not about these big things that have to do with worldwide organizations. Of course, NATO and the European Union are important because these are defensive alliances. But at the end of the day, many Ukrainians are asking ourselves, if we were in NATO, would it have been any different than the Budapest Memorandum? I would remind you that in 1993, if I'm not mistaken, Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security guarantees from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. So the nuclear powers came in and said, we will protect you. Now, the Ukrainian newly independent elite was naive enough to sign a memorandum rather than signing an agreement that would have been legally binding. But they'd been in power for two years. They didn't know what they were doing, quite frankly, less than 2 years. This was something that was completely new to them. So, of these naive kids giving up nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees that basically meant nothing. Now, the question now becomes, if they meant nothing in Budapest, does Article 5 really mean something? The question that is asked in the chat, do we want to be in NATO? Yeah, of course we want to be in NATO. Hopefully, NATO will provide us with more security guarantees that we have now. But at the end of the day, it's a hope. The same way as we hoped for security guarantees after Budapest. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's our war to win. And you know what, folks? If you can help us, we're grateful. We're very grateful, because what we're fighting for is, as Auke said very correctly, is what you take for granted every day. But we have to get through it ourselves, and we have to win it. We have to win it. We have a new country to build after we're done.
I think it's also a good thing to remind people that, because there's, we're going back for a moment to like peace talks. First of all, of course, the Minsk talks were a way to stop the violence, but it wasn't a way to reach peace, because there was still an illegal occupation of Ukraine. But one of the things where I run into in our communities that are focused so much on harmony is the idea, let's just stop fighting. But my idea is that if that happens, there's still, Russia will not stop fighting, or in the occupied areas, Russia will continue its campaign against Ukrainian culture, the deportation of children, the rape of women. Can you talk a little bit about that? So if Ukraine would be fully occupied by Russia, what would your life look like?
Look, I had it was interesting on February 24th. On February 20th, just before the full-scale invasion, I had a chat with a reporter from Fox News. I was doing relatively regular sort of commentary for the U.S. for CNN, for Fox News. It's trying to be balanced, if you like, between the two of them. For BBC, for a lot of different outlets. And the chap from Fox News said, look, good luck, but we've been told to get out of the country. And so I said, okay, well, see you, hopefully soon. On February 26th, I get a phone call. He says, well, the invasion started. I didn't believe that it would start. He didn't believe that it would start. I was convincing him that it would, because I knew what was coming. Or I thought I did anyway. And he tells me, look, we were just at the State Department and we were showed a document that we don't know where it came from, but we were apparently told that it's from American intelligence. And it's a list of people compiled by the Russian forces, FSB, whatever, that are to be arrested and killed once the Russian invasion is successful. My name was on it, and he was giving me a warning. So, in answer to your question, this is a war of survival. This is a war not just survival symbolically, meaning of the Ukrainian people, values, etc. It's physical survival. And we've seen this not just in Bucha, in Irpin, and in areas around Kyiv. We've seen this in Izium, we've seen this in Kherson, we've seen it in Kharkiv, we've seen it in Mariupol. Mariupol was a city of 400,000 people. 400,000 people. Do you know how many are left? 20. 20,000 people out of 400,000 are left. The city is no longer in existence. Bakhmut was a city of 75,000 people. It's now maybe 500. The Russians are coming in like locusts and destroying everything. It's a Hollywood film. I mean, at the end of the day, we see these. Independence Day, remember that film? Very similar. So the question of peace or not peace is a very difficult question because, as I said, as long as the Russian Federation remains a threat to Ukraine, it is an existential threat for all of us. Certainly for those of us that have independent-minded values, certainly for those of us that actually believe in and are patriots of our own country.
One of the things that hasn't come up in the chat or in the conversation today, as I've watched the last, whatever it's been now, 17 months or so of the war, the extraordinary restraint on behalf of the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian people, to not go into Russia or Russian territory. It's just been mind-blowing to me that, I understand the geography in terms of the landmass. I understand the limited resources and everything else, but to have the restraint that the Ukrainians have has been extraordinary. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, Tom, let's not be too naive about this. The Americans are providing significant amounts of weapons, and those weapons have strings attached. And one of the strings attached, and let's just say it's an open secret in Ukraine, is that those weapons are not to be used on Russian territory. We have that's part of the American deal, if you like. And as the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, has stated previously, that's one of the reasons that we need to have our own military-industrial complex revitalized so that we have those weapons, so that we can attack deep into Russian territory. Because it's a little bit strange that they're bombing our cities, and these cities are very often 300, 400, 500 kilometers from the Russian border, and at the same time, we can't actually bomb or attack any of those launch pads or airports that are actually within Russian territory. So that I think is something that is an open secret in Ukraine, and it's one of the reasons that we have such an issue with F-16s. not being provided, and airplanes not being provided at the moment, because there is a fear on our allies' part that those will be used in an offensive way within Russian territory proper. Having said that, one of the good news that we woke up with yesterday was the bombing of the Crimean Bridge. And that is, again, something that a lot of people were very, very happy about in Ukraine, because it's a symbol, first of all, that Putin built this illegal construction, but more importantly, it is yet more proof of the fact that Crimea is definitely part of Ukraine and should not be considered a place of vacation spots for Russians this summer.
On the issue of Crimea, there was a question asking about, why Khrushchev made Crimea part of Ukraine in 1954. Obviously, that is interpreted as that before that it wasn't part of Ukraine. You already made some comments about that, but can you give a little bit of more on the historic connection?
Sure.
And sure. Also about, of course, the Tatars, and also about the connection to Russia?
Okay, well, this gets us back into, whenever we talk about borders and territory, we have to get into history, and this is always very problematic. We look at history within Europe. There's this wonderful YouTube thing that you can go on to and sort of look at map of Europe over 1,000 years, right? And you look at the way in which borders have changed, even not just over 1,000 years, but over the last 100 years within Europe. So the issue is that Crimea was after the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. Crimea was sort of the place where the Tatars, which are effectively if you like, one of the groups that was involved in the Mongol invasion of the 13th century, they settled in Crimea. Crimea was very much a desert place. It wasn't really a very attractive place to live, and the Crimean Tatars made their home there. Then, during the expansion of the Russian Empire in the 18th century, the Russians started settling large portions of Crimea, and of course we had the Crimean War in the 19th century, which would have been studied if those of you that studied the 19th century, you know that the British and the French fought the Russians over Crimea. The Turks were involved, etc. That's a 19th century history. The point is that Crimea as a territory, if you want to consider it traditionally part of a particular ethnos, then it would be Tatar. That is the traditional sort of thing. Now, late 19th century, the Russian Empire is basically effectively trying to, if you like, cancel anything that is Ukrainian. There were several edicts of the Russian Tsar banning the Ukrainian language, banning Ukrainian universities, banning Ukrainian schools, etc. So there's a very large, at the end of the 19th century, there's a very large push against Ukraine. During the revolutionary period of the First World War, Ukraine declares its independence, is very quickly, it declares its independence in 1917, during what the history books in the West would call the Civil War. The Ukrainian independence movement is quashed by the Red Army, and the Red Army basically occupies what today would be Ukraine, except for Western Ukraine. The South was really never part of that short-lived independent Ukraine. Crimea was, for a period of time, actually declared to be an autonomous, if not independent, Tatar republic. And then all of that was incorporated into the Soviet Union. During the Second World War, when Ukraine and Crimea were occupied by the Germans, after the liberation by Stalin, and I use that word in quotation marks, what happens is that the Crimean population the Tatar population of Crimea is forcibly removed to Central Asia. And Crimea is settled by retired Russian military officers. So it becomes not only a military base, but also a place for, if you like, retired Russian military officers, Soviet military officers, etc. So it becomes very much Russianized, and it becomes very much a place that is militarized in terms of its culture. However, because of the issues that have to do with supplying of water, supplying of foodstuffs, generally supplying Crimea, it becomes really problematic. And in 1954, Khrushchev, who was the general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, makes the decision that he's going to transfer Crimea internally from the jurisdiction of the Russian Federation, which was a part of the Soviet Union, to the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Republic, which is part of the Soviet Union. In other words, it'd be the equivalent of, I don't know, transferring sort of one, I guess, one county from one state to another state within the United States, right? In other words, it's literally, this is an internal shuffle, etc. But this happens in 1954, and the reason that it happens is because there's a huge canal that's put in place from Ukraine into Crimea to supply water, and it just made more administrative sense for Ukraine to be administering Crimea as opposed to Russia, to the Russian Federation, where there was no land bridge with it anyway. So, I mean, this was really an internal decision. After 1991, Crimea has remained part of Ukraine, and what I think is very important is in the referendum on independence in 1991, more than 50%, in fact, almost 60% of the Crimean population, which is primarily ethnic Russian, primarily Tatar, because the Tatars started to return by that time from Central Asia, and some Ukrainians, the majority of Crimean population voted for an independent Ukraine. And so at the end of the day, it was a referendum that was, recognized worldwide as being something that was a legitimate election, and the Crimeans voted to be part of Ukraine. So this is symbolically important. Now, one of the questions was, will Ukrainians trade Crimea for peace? I think it's too late to talk about that, and I certainly would not like to talk about that publicly at this point. I think that this is something that may happen, depending on how things work out on the front line. It was certainly something that was talked about during the 2015-2020 period, when there was a search for peace of some sort, which obviously was shattered by the Russians in 2022.
I think
sorry for the long history.
Thank you very much, because I think that's really important context. I think another important contextual thing to say here is that what we see is that Russia is basically an empire that occupies lots of minorities, groups around the world, especially during the Soviet Union, but still. And so these empires fall apart, and historic occupation doesn't make a rightful claim to the territory today, because that would mean that the UK should rule the US. It would mean that the UK should rule India, the Dutch should rule Indonesia, right? So when these empires fall apart, then we see that, say, the original cultural entities rise as nation states rather than as empires.
I think that's exactly right.
As we bring the broadcast to a close today, just any final thoughts from either of you?
As a final thought, I'll say this. Again, thank you. I understand full well that people are, no one wants war. No one, lots of people say that, peace is, even a bad peace is better than a supposedly good war, because there is no such thing as a good war. I understand all of those thoughts, and I might have actually agreed with them 18 months ago. But this is a war of aggression, and it's also a war of destruction from one side to another. There's no question about the fact that who is righteous in this war and who's not. The question might be, do you believe it's your war to fight? And my answer, of course, is no, it's not. It's our war to fight. All we're doing as Ukrainians is asking the world and thanking the world for their help. Because the values that we stand for, we believe, are also the values that you stand for. You know, sorry, Tom, I'll use this one, use the American, you know, what is it? And the rocket's red glare gave truth to the night that our flag was still there. Our flag is still here. If you believe in the words that are in each of your anthems, understand that that's precisely what you're supporting Ukrainians in their fight for. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, I think that there's still quite a few topics that we haven't touched upon, but we will continue tomorrow. And tomorrow we will focus on the future, how we would, what would be a road forward. I see one comment I want to make is, I see some statements happening in the chat, and I just want to invite everybody, please check your sources. Right, there is a dynamic of Russian propaganda getting fed into the internet, which then in the West becomes a second truth to what's happening here. So I would invite everybody, please check your sources, find out what if it's really true, what you're thinking about peace talks and things like that. Thank you very much, Mikhailo. I know you're on a very busy schedule, but I really appreciate that you took time to join us. And tomorrow we will build upon this rich presentation of yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you both. Wonderful conversation. Certainly a terrific education for the Humanity Rising audience, and happy to have provided the opportunity for you to be with us today. And Auke, once again, thank you for yesterday, today, and looking forward to tomorrow's conversation. Thank you both.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.